Get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Mariah Russell, and I'm a committee member for Native Seed Communities, which is a statewide project of the Indiana Native Plant Society, and you'll hear us refer to that as INPS for short. I also work as the Project Wingspan Indiana State Coordinator with Pollinator Partnership. Also with us today is a face you're most familiar with if you've seen presentations with us before. Bill Daniels is on the call, but is kind of guiding me through the first leading of this presentation. So thank you, Bill. And we also have Deb Housen, who is a tech master, kind of lending her skills to make sure the progress or the presentation runs smoothly. So thank you, Deb. Our team welcomes you. I'm very glad that you've joined us for Greg Monzel's presentation, Seed Saving for Sustenance, Foraging to Farming. Before I introduce Greg, I'd like to share a little bit of information on the Indiana Native Seed Communities. So we promote networks of native plant enthusiasts working together regionally to procure, process, and propagate native plant seeds to increase the presence of these beautiful and ecologically important native plants to all of our landscapes. Our presentations are devoted to discussing the propagation of native plants from seeds and the spotlighting of community organizations and individuals that mobilize native plant enthusiasts to use these seed-grown plants in all landscapes. We have a lot of resources on our INPS website and social media that we'll share links to in the chat. A few notes before we go to our speaker. Again, for the best experience, make sure you're muted unless you're invited to unmute. And if you have questions, please pop those in the chat for Deb to field them as we go along. So Greg's let us know that he'd like to answer those in time so that he can address any questions at the moment he's talking about it. So you can go ahead and put those in as we're moving along. So let me introduce Greg. He is a community herbalist and foraging instructor with a passion for connecting people and plants. He is the founder of Persimmon Herb School on the southeast side of Indianapolis. He's a full-time botany student at Ball State University with a special interest in conservation and restoration of culturally important plant species, such as wild rice and American lotus. In addition to being the Indiana Native Plant Society's Central Chapter President, he's also our newest committee member of Indiana Native Seed Communities. So welcome, Greg, and I'm really excited for your talk. I'm going to pass it over to you.
Well, thank you, Mariah. I appreciate you and appreciate everybody for joining us tonight. I'm really excited to be here with you all and just sharing some good time with some other plant people. So today was actually my first day back to Ball State for the fall semester, and I just came from my dendrology class, which I'm super excited about. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And just, this is a presentation I initially did for the Central Indiana Seed Swap a couple years back. So this presentation is, seed saving for sustenance, from foraging to farming. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about myself, but first, it's important for me to acknowledge that we live and teach and practice grow on the ancestral land of Native Americans, especially the Lenape and the Miami people, you may know as the Delaware and Miami people. And because of the type of work that I do with gathering wild plants for food and for medicine, there's a lot of plants that are native here that are sacred and really important cultural plants for folks out there. And we often think of, Native Americans as being kind of displaced and not very present, but this work has brought me in contact with a lot of Native folks who are local and are present and still very much here on the land and practicing and reclaiming these traditions. And so it's important for me to honor them and their practices and the sacred plants. So that's something that I really do put first, and it's not just some boilerplate that I stick on presentations. Mariah introduced me a little bit already. My background includes growing up in a family with people that hunted and fished and foraged for mushrooms and nuts and things. And I just thought that's kind of like what people did. And only as an adult did I find out that was kind of weird that I learned how to do all these things somewhat from, my youth. I grew up spending time in Granny's garden, and so I think about Granny and Grandpa a lot. And and this is really what foraging and gathering medicine plants is about for me. It's about connection and meaning, and it's a way for me to feel really engaged with my ecology. You know, to be a member of the ecology, you have to be co-evolving with the plants and animals in your landscape. And if you're not actively eating them and engaging with them, maybe you're not doing that. So I encourage everybody to try some wild foods, try to eat a little bit of wild food every day. And we'll talk a little bit about what some of those practices might look like. Because of course, some plants are sensitive. We don't want to be gathering, ginseng and other sensitive plants in Indiana. But there are plenty of edible plants out there that are perfectly ethical and wise, perhaps, to gather. So we'll get into more detail here momentarily. Here's an interesting fact. So part of my background is in food production and food, grocery business. And I'm fascinated by the globalization of the food system and the way that we have exported, especially grain crops throughout the world, such that these three plants, wheat, rice, and maize, provide over 50% of the world's plant-derived food energy. That is, to me, is a staggering amount of our daily caloric intake on the planet that come from just a few different seed crops. There's another list of crops there that provide a lot more as well. And to me, that's a real kind of tentative situation because we have so many potential diseases or issues that could happen with these plants. As we saw, like for instance, with wheat, with the wheat stem rust issues that were happening in Africa and elsewhere. And our food system is more resilient and our communities are more resilient with a broader base of food crops. And to me, I get really geeked out and passionate about learning about what else is available out here because with climate change and the uncertainty of our global economic systems and things and warfare and violence and polarization and stuff, I'm not trying to like be totally doom and gloom here, but it's important, I think, for survival for our species to maintain these traditions of gathering these traditional food plants and not lose it all to commercialized agriculture. So I hope to share a little bit of that passion with you guys tonight. So for 95% of human history, we were foraging foods before agriculture as a species. And so it's really kind of odd, I think, that we have reduced our food supply to so few plants. Looking at the global food supply, there's 30,000 edible plants out there, and 12 different species supply 75% of the world's food. Again, traditional economies, traditional people needed their traditional foods, and there's been a lot of disruption in indigenous communities around the world due to industrialized agriculture. And I think that's a problem that we can help, by becoming aware of it and engaging it and engaging our own ecology for food and medicine ourselves. That can be an important solution for climate change and for that uncertainty that I mentioned. Part of my passion and why I got interested in medicinal plants in particular is that as a young adult, I didn't have a lot of financial security. I didn't have health insurance for decades. I've been self-employed for most of my career. And so it was just too expensive and not practical to have health insurance. And so I started to look at natural medicine, and I started to see how valuable plant medicines can really be in daily practice. And I had various experiences that kept me out of the hospital, that kept my family out of the hospital, or out of the doctor's office. And it was just shocking to me. Once I started studying plants, I realized there is just so much to learn about plants that, you can never run out of things to know about it and things to learn about it. So this picture here shows some plants I found along Tippecanoe River on a canoe trip one night. These, I believe, are feral ornamental gourds that were growing along the riverbank up there. And I collected the unripe fruits. They're just like a zucchini or yellow squash. And they made a delicious little dinner for me. Foraging is also fun. Okay, so take your kids foraging. They love this stuff. In traditional communities, kids are who would have learned That's the age you would have learned wild plants and you would have learned how to gather foods and medicine when you were like 4 to 6 years old. One of the most interesting plants I think to gather for food and for sustenance is this plant Manoomin. It's also known as wild rice, which is a little bit of a misnomer. It's not, botanically related to rice, but it's called wild rice, like many European words for plants in America. It's related to something that we knew from European culture. So we called it wild rice because it grows in aquatic conditions the way that rice does. But it's a very different plant. And there's two species that are found in Indiana and throughout the Great Lakes region. There's Zizania palustris is widely known as northern wild rice by botanists. The traditional folks I know call it lake rice, and it is typically found in more of a lake, lacustrine type environment with slower currents and shallower water. Then you will find Zizania aquatica, southern wild rice, or river rice. And in Indiana, our populations are mostly Zizania aquatica. This one on the left, this picture on the left is Zizania aquatica, also from that same stretch of the Tippecanoe River. And on the right here, this is my racing partner Ross, and we're in a patty of palustris there. So that's in Michigan. Indiana does not have sustainable rice populations for, I'll say for colonizer culture folks to be gathering. There are traditional gatherers, native gatherers, Potawatomi and Miami people who are gathering wild rice in Indiana with permission, with proper permits and things like that. But there's just not enough here to be really culturally sensitive and gather it here. This plant is, I think, so fascinating. If you look at the Ojibwe traditions and look at something called the Seven Fires Prophecy, this is something culturally that's been handed down through oral tradition for hundreds of years. And the Ojibwe people migrated from the sort of like Delaware River region up the East Coast and up the St. Lawrence Seaway to the Great Lakes region. And part of the prophecy was that they needed to find where the food grew on water. And when they found this Manoomin, they knew that they were home. Manoomin means good berry or like good fruit. And it's a very tasty thing. If you've ever eaten wild rice, it is tastier, it's nuttier than your typical white or brown rice. It has a lot more nutrition packed in it. And this is a common thread with foraged foods, is that they're going to typically have a lot more micronutrients than your commercialized varieties. In Indiana and elsewhere, it's really suffered a lot of habitat loss due to draining of swamps, draining of streams, and other river sloughs and things like that. Stream channelization is a big one. All of the logging that happened in the early 20th century really took a toll on wild rice. So all these logs were harvested in the forests. They were clear cut throughout much of the state and rolled into the valley. And if they could be floated downstream, they would be. Otherwise, they might just be burned in the valley to make way for agriculture. But all of those logs going down these streams ripped out these rice beds. And there are maybe hundreds of streams and lakes, especially in Michigan, that were completely decimated by the logging industry there. Now, wild rice is sensitive to a lot of different threats. It can't tolerate high nutrient levels in water. So forces of erosion due to agricultural practices take a toll on wild rice. And the invasive Asian carp species that kind of muck up the water, and they kind of forage through the muck and eat any little benthic invertebrates and seeds and stuff that they can find. They eat wild rice seeds. So it is losing habitat. It's facing a lot of threats, and it has it needs some help. It needs people looking after it. So on this slide, you can see this is what it looks like harvesting wild rice. There's me, my partner Ross there took this picture. My leg is hitched over a pole there, and so there's a long wooden push pole that's used to propel the boat through the rice bed. Now, this is again one of the four sacred foods of the Ojibwe people. And I asked my friend Courtney about this at a wild rice camp last fall. If this is so important and this is so sacred to the Anishinaabe and other natives, you know, is it a risk to share this with Europeans? And is there, or your people from a European culture, right? So, like, I'm using that word to mean folks like myself whose ancestors came from Europe and migrated here. And there are obviously some cultural issues with their interactions with the natives here. So, leaving that kind of history, without a lot of, I mean, the Miami people were forcibly removed from Indiana. So they are, one of the most like prevalent, longest settled here in Indiana in the Fort Wayne region, which was Kekionga, their capital city. And, so we need to be sensitive. We need to be cautious in how we approach these traditional foods. And it's not just going to be a free for all for foragers like myself to go out and just gather all the wild rice in the world. But there are ways to do it right. Interact with the local natives, find out who they are, and find out what the sacred foods are so you can avoid those. You can avoid those kind of issues. I know other foragers, they don't do this, and they have issues with natives in their regions. And it's not good. It's not good for anybody. It's not good for foragers. It's not good for the natives. It's not good for the local economy. There's just nothing good about it. We need to work together, and we need to, do our part as people coming from a colonizer background to, I don't know about reparations, if that's quite the right word, but to reconnect and to heal the damage that our ancestors are responsible for. Anyway, this plant needs some stewardship. It needs some help. And so anyway, to get back to my story about rice camp, I asked my friend Courtney, why would natives want to share this with, people of any background, like colonizer culture? And she told me that they want Manoomin to be sacred to all people. And it was just a profound thing to me to think about that they're sharing these gifts of their culture, their traditional food, their traditional ways to gather it, to store it, to process it, to make it food. And it's such a gift. It's a real gift. And I just found it to be powerful. And so I think we need to do our part, to take care of this plant. And to me, it is sacred. And this is something about foraging. When you're eating, when your food and your sustenance is coming from the land that you're living on, that you're interacting with, and your ecology, you are part of it, and it's sacred to you in maybe a little bit different way. It's a little bit more real, perhaps, in how the land is sustaining you. And I do want to share that. I want that to be infectious. I want you guys to take that and to connect with your own land and your own plants in your own backyard. Plants, many of our wild weeds that we deal with in the garden or landscape were brought here by our ancestors and have gone wild because we've forgotten what to do with them and how to steward them. But this plant, I talked to one of my contacts in the Miami Nation. She said they found a rice bed that was about 8 acres. And they got permits for it, started harvesting it and caring for it. And that 8-acre rice bed spread to 12 acres. And then the next year they came back and continued to work with it and traditionally harvested and give blessings and offerings for it and the water. And it became 40 acres. And now it's 100 plus acres. And so there's a little bit of a paradox. So I think that conservationists have a little bit of a lag to catch up here, that when we tend plants and we steward them in situ, in the environment, that their growth responds in a different way than it might if we weren't interacting with them. And some plants, like this plant, which has been interacting with humans, gathering it now for thousands of years, it may need that. It may need us to be out there to maintain its species niche. And so when you're gathering this plant, a lot of the grain goes in the boat, as you can see in my boat here. This is about a day's harvest. It was about 50 pounds. We're new harvesters. We're not very good at it. A good pair of harvesters can put 100 pounds of Manoomin in the boat in a day. That's a lot of food for your people. That's a lot of food for your family. And this is a staple food. When I started out teaching about herbalism and foraging foods, I really started out more with medicinal plants. And I had a fella who came to one of my classes who challenged me, where do you find calories from plants in nature? It's hard. But this is one plant that gives you a lot of carbohydrate, a lot of calories, and easy to gather. You gather it in boats. These were like boats were the cars of, the Paleolithic era. And so this is like the easy transportation. It's like taking a taxi to the grocery store and being able to fill up your boat. Of course, it's only ripe once a year. So you've got to be able to harvest that year supply and store it well. Um, but this, I think, is a magical plant. There's no place more interesting than foraging in a boat, on a lake, in a paddy of rice where you can't see anything but other people out there gathering rice. It's so cool. The birds, the ducks, the rice where I harvest here was actually reintroduced to this lake by Ducks Unlimited, and back in like the 60s, 70s. So this is not a natural lake. This is not really truly a wild population. And the grains of this particular rice are small. You'll find on traditionally harvested Manuman stands. Um, but I think Indiana, we would have had a lot of it up in northwestern Indiana in the whole like Grand Kankakee Marsh region, and it can still be found there, but just not in the kind of way that it used to be. So this is what I'm passionate about, and what I like sharing about is conservation of these traditional food plants, because I think they need us back in the landscape. Here's another one I love to gather. These are American hazelnuts, and these aren't something I grew up gathering, but they're something that I've grown as an adult, and I think they're a really charismatic shrub, and that we could use these more in the landscape. They have a beautiful fall foliage. They make a great kind of low and spreading wide shrub. It's thick. It's great habitat for birds and for other, ground dwelling critters. And this goes great in a hedgerow. These guys are delicious. If you've ever had Nutella, you're looking at like a hazelnut cocoa mix there. And our local native species are every bit as good as the European ones. They are, however, smaller. And so it is quite a lot to gather them and to crack them. I don't know if you guys can still see me or not, but up above me, I have a nutcracker called a Dave Built nutcracker, and it's a very excellent forager's tool. So if you're going to get into small nuts like this, that's a great tool to have, and it will make processing them a lot easier for you. I like making them into hazelnut pies, kind of like a pecan pie, but with hazelnuts. We also crush them and batter our fish with them. And for a lot of these woody plants, DNR has a bounty out for seeds. And for maybe I think my prices here are a couple years old, but the DNR was paying 2.5 cents per hazelnut for the state nursery supply. So if you're into this kind of thing, you like gathering seeds, there's different ways that you can maybe make a few bucks while you're doing it, while you're also filling your belly and having a good day's work. While I'm between plants, are there any questions so far?
No, there's not.
Okay.
At this moment. Thanks, Greg.
All right. Great. Remember, just jump in there. Okay. I can go on all night about this, but walnuts here on the left are black walnuts. These are probably the first plants that I grew up foraging. Granny would let's see. My dad would pick them up. He'd put them in a bucket. We'd put them out in the gravel driveway and run them over with the truck. And then he'd go out and pick up the ones that got, the outer hull cleaned off of. And Granny he'd take them and crack them with a hammer in the garage. And then Granny would pick through them and pull out all the good nuts. And she made black walnut pies. Oh, they're so good. I love a black walnut. And I know they're not for everybody. The flavor is a little stronger and pungent. They're more aromatic than the cultivated varieties, but to me that gives them a more distinguished flavor, a richer complexity. And I have black walnuts that I've kept for several years now, and they're still just as good as the day I picked them. So with nuts like these, the way I process these now, I harvest the green nuts, and I go to a place in the city here where I live where it's a tennis court, and I can just like use a snow shovel and pick up black walnuts off the tennis court. And I put them in a big tote and I bring them home. I use a paint mixer paddle and a power drill, and I put a bunch of water over the nuts and the green holes, and then I run my power drill paint paddle in there, and it knocks off all those green holes. So that is excellent for dyeing fabric and for toenail fungus and other things, but you don't want to eat those outer holes, except for maybe some limited medicinal use. These nuts that you have left are basically like a pack. They're sealed up. They're like vacuum packed in those little nuts. If you drive over them with a car, they get little micro fractures, and the nuts will go bad inside after a matter of a year or so. But if you don't do that, you use the paint paddle technique that I just mentioned, they will stay good for a long time. You dry them out, and when you dry the nuts, it's an important part of curing a lot of different tree nuts. When you dry them, the flesh of the nut separates a little more from the husk. So then when you crack it, they're more likely to fall out and come free. When they're fresh and green right off the ground, they're still swollen in there, and they're just full of juices, and they're at their peak vitality, but not maybe at their best edibility. On the right side here, you've got a picture of some shagbark hickory nuts. These make an excellent nut milk, and this was a traditional Miami food, is my understanding, is we take the whole nuts there. So that, after you knock off the green, they have a 4-parted green shell on hickories. You don't want to do this with all hickories because like a bitter nut hickory, a pig nut hickory aren't going to taste good. But certainly, a shagbark hickory, a shellbark hickory, and a mocker nut hickory are delicious. And we take the whole nut in the hard shell and mash them up with a giant mortar and pestle, or you can use a hammer. You can put them between a couple sheets of fabric and pound them with a board or something like that. Mash them up, okay? Outer holes and all. Take that and then boil it in water. So take a big pot, fill it about halfway with your hickory nuts, and then fill it all the way up with water and boil that. And it will boil out a lot of the fat and hickory flavor. It's got a, pecan is a hickory. So that's the flavor you're going to get, is a pecan-like nut. And the nut milk that you get from it is so good. You can just pour it right off the top. All the nuts, the hard shells and everything will stay in the bottom of your pot after you boil it. My friend Michael Hood down in southern Indiana, he takes that and then he'll mix in a little bit of maple syrup and put it in an ice cream maker, and it makes a beautiful ice cream. And all it is shagbark hickory nut milk and maple syrup. 2 forageable things that you can get maybe in your backyard. A lot of these, so butternuts were really, more highly sought after when they were common here. And butternuts were once common in Indiana. Of course, they're suffering from butternut canker, which is hosted on walnut trees as well and introduced fungal disease. And so we don't have butternuts on the landscape as commonly as we used to, though I hear there are some in Hamilton County and a few other places in Indiana. I have some planted, and I'm hopeful to get those in the future to be able to actually try one. I haven't tried one yet. I went to a workshop at the Great Lakes Foragers Gathering this year where we made black walnut nut butter. So we took the black walnuts, we cracked them, we cleaned out the nuts inside, and we ground them up and put in a little bit of salt, and it was so good. I've never had that before. It was the best nut butter I've ever had. I'm a big fan of like peanut butter. I'm like, probably 10% peanut butter by weight at this point, if you are what you eat. I love an almond butter, but this black walnut butter was so amazing. There's nothing as silky and rich and fatty as that. Oh God, I can smell it and taste it. It's so good. DNR will buy these also for their tree nursery. So those little arbor tree seedlings that you get from your local plant giveaways, they grow those out from seed. And they put them in a bed, they grow them out, and then they come in with a harvesting tool that cuts them off about a foot underneath the soil. And then you get your little, your little seedling. You can just put them in the ground, or you can sell them to DNR. I have people try to give me walnuts every year. They're like, "Hey, Greg, do you want some walnuts? I got walnuts in my yard. You want to come take those?" So you can get them for free. Get your friends to bag them up for you. Just don't let them mold. These plants all have a high timber value also. So there's other things that come along with walnuts and hickories and these other plants. They suck up a lot of carbon from the atmosphere. Gosh, isn't that a good thing?
So Greg, I do have a quick question for you.
Okay.
So, how do you manage to get them harvested, the walnuts and pecans and such, before the animals get to them? They seem to know the exact minute almost that the hazelnuts are ripe, and off they go.
Oh, man, the hazelnuts, the chipmunks and the squirrels will go after the hazelnuts when they're still green. So it's just a matter of sharing abundance. And what I do is focus on those crops that are most abundant in a given year. So, what was it last year? Was it red oak acorns? Were really banging last year, but there weren't many walnuts. So I didn't gather walnuts last year. This year there's a lot of walnuts. This year there's a lot of acorns. We were talking earlier. There's a lot of things this year because the weather's been so nice and so good for plant growth. So there's a lot of fruit production this year. So it's a very abundant season. But that's what I do. I target mast species. So the tree nuts will typically have a mast cycle where they regulate their seed predators by oversatiating them, kind of like cicadas do. They produce so much that those animals will run out of an appetite after a while. That they'll just fill them all up. A given oak tree can produce thousands of pounds of acorn in a year. And so when there's that kind of abundance, you don't have to compete with the animals anymore. You're just another one of them.
Okay, that's true. With the walnuts, so when they have that green outer shell, do those need to come off fairly quickly and then just dry out the black, that I know, wrinkly part of it, or can they sit in that outer as well for a period of time?
They can sit in the outer shell for some time and be stored that way as long as they're dried, but they take up a lot more space. So if you're trying to dry them and store them, it's really more effective to remove those earlier. Plus, they can harbor things like codling moths and other seed predator type issues. So better to remove that. Like most seeds, if you can clean them, you're going to probably have a better result in terms of viability and keep them in good shape.
Okay.
Now, if you are trying to plant them, you want to probably do that when they're fresh and not dry them out.
Well, I have found that the squirrels do a great job in planting nuts. Actually, I think they're saving them, but they never remember where they're at. So
Yeah. How could they remember them all?
Yeah, exactly.
When we moved to this property 14 years ago, and I planted two of the first plants I planted were some improved varieties of pecans. And then once I planted the pecans, I noticed, well, there's a similar looking tree coming up in my yard, and there can't be pecans coming off my trees yet. They're not ripe. And so I noticed my neighbor has a pecan tree right across the street. And so the squirrels were already planting them. I didn't need to plant these improvements at all. The squirrels were already going nuts with them.
Yeah, they're very good at that. So, one more question on the walnuts. So how long would you need to dry the walnuts, and then, or how do you know when they're dry? I mean, I've got them all over the yard.
Okay.
And
so when I remove the outer hull, I'm doing that in like a bucket or tote of water, and so they are hydrating more. So at that point, I rinse them all. I get as much of the outer hull off as I can. I use a 1/2-inch hardware cloth screen that I use for screening compost, and I screen my nuts through that, and I am able to get all of the hulls out. Now, keep in mind, those are allelopathic, and you don't want to just put that anywhere in your landscape. You want to put that around where you have native plantings that are tolerant of black walnut hulls, not in your vegetable garden.
okay.
So bear that in mind. But then once they are, I'll put them in totes, or not totes. What am I saying? Crates. I'll put them in crates where, like a produce crate where they can breathe, or baskets are perfect for this, shallow baskets. Keep them in a shallow layer, maybe like 3 inches deep or so, or 3 layers of nuts deep. And then I put them in, we have a drying room here, which is very special. but you don't need that. You can just put them in front of a fan, or on top of a heat register, or near a wood stove or somewhere like that, that they're going to get a little bit more airflow, a little more heat maybe, and be able to dry out. They want to dry. They naturally want to dry, and that's part of how seeds work and how they do their thing. So it's not. Don't overthink it. If you're struggling with it a little bit about what to do with them, as long as they have enough air and they don't get moldy is the main thing. Let them dry. I cure them usually for about 4 weeks, and then start cracking them. And as long as they're cracking easy and coming out of the shell, and they seem dry enough to do that, that's dry enough for storage. And they'll continue to cure. They'll continue to dry out a little bit in storage. But like I said, as long as the outer hull of the inner hull of the nut is still intact and not damaged at all, they will keep, because there's very little oxygen's getting through there. So they will keep in that stage for a long time. Whereas if you cracked all those black walnuts, you'd have to freeze them or something. You'd have to refrigerate them, or the omega-3s would oxidize and they'd go bad within a short period of time. So I like to store them in that inner hull part.
Got it. Okay, great. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm looking at the chat now, and I see Brooke's message about Robin Wall Kimmerer. Excellent. Some of the same folks that I'm hanging out with at Rice Camp said that her book is considered sacred text in the Native communities up there. So, okay. Let's see. I'm screen sharing, but now I can't see what I'm sharing. Oh, here we go. Sorry. Okay. Moving on. Next plant. I just visited this plant up in Hamilton County last week on Tuesday. This is American lotus, Nolembo lutea. It's our native lotus species. A lot of folks don't realize we have a native lotus species. And I was in a workshop, actually I think Brooke was there too, with Doug Pakongi at Kotiwi Strawtown Park. And he was talking about Miami native culture. And I asked, this kind of foolish question of what was like some of the most favorite plants, or like kind of most desirable, or what was the favorite food of like the Miami people in their traditional culture. And he was like, well, we didn't really have the privilege of having favorites like that. We had to eat what we could get easily and what had enough nutrition. And so one of those was lotus. And so lotus roots could be gathered in almost any season, as long as you have a canoe and you can paddle out to the marsh, you know where they grow, and you can usually identify the plant in any season. If you know what to look for, then you just get knee deep in the mud and root around in there, and you find them with your feet, and you pull out these big mud bananas. And those mud bananas are a big tuber. They're about this shape and size of banana. And if you've ever seen lotus root, like in an Asian restaurant, it has that beautiful kind of honeycomb sort of pattern in there, where it has the, is it parenchyma, or what the structures are that allow air down to the roots that aquatic plants often have. Very cool stuff. Very interesting flavor. Peaty, nutty, swampy a little bit, like many foods that grow in the muck like this are. My favorite part to eat are the nuts. And so in this picture where you can see the two pods, the one on top is what I would gather for food. The one on bottom that's drying out and has the brown seeds is a little past the stage where I would gather it for food. Those are going to be your seed ripe ones. If you're trying to plant this in a pond, this typically grows in about 6 inches to maybe several feet deep of water. I've seen it on Lake Monroe. I've seen it in Zionsville in a retention pond. I've seen it in northeastern or northwestern Indiana for sure. And the place I usually go is in Hamilton County. Where I've seen this plant, it has expanded from about 8 acres to at least 20 acres now. I have a hard time estimating acreage just looking at it, but it's amazing how quick this plant can grow. It is very charismatic. It's our largest wildflower. So you can see that flower is as big as my face. That's touching my chin. That's like literally right up to my face. That's how big they are. I'm not putting out in front of me like a big fish trying to show you how big this flower is. It has also one of the largest leaves. So it's just a tremendously charismatic plant, grows in that mucky, swampy soil and turns it into this beautiful, amazing plant, and sight to behold, and this amazing food. So the green pod, I'll harvest that whole, and I like to roast these over an open fire is my preferred cooking method. I've pan roasted them, but they don't come out as good. So I just really, it's kind of weird, but I just only cook these on an open fire. We do a fair amount of open fire cooking in our home anyway, so not too odd around here, but maybe not everybody's cup of tea. The pod is thickened at the back. It's kind of shaped like a shower head. So you can't really tell from here, but there's like a cone shape on the back of the receptacle. And I'll face that towards the fire, or maybe even put it right on some hot coals. And as it roasts through, you can kind of see the surface where the seeds are exposed there. You'll see that look cooked. Like if you've cooked a vegetable before, right? So you know what it looks like when you go from raw green pepper to cooked green pepper. That's what you're looking for. And when that whole receptacle looks cooked on that upper surface where those seeds are exposed, then it's ready. And I'll kind of rotate it a couple times as it's cooking. And then when it's ready, I'll pull it off, let it cool a little bit, and crack open that whole big pod. And the individual seeds are about the size of a grape, a small grape. That's when they're underripe. So they're still juicy, they're still tender, and they're still hydrated at that stage. That's again that green stage, the top capsule there. And then you'll open up that seed coat. It's a very hard seed coat, but it's, once it's cooked, you can just open it with your teeth or your fingernails. And inside will be this little kernel that you see in the very bottom picture. It looks like a little eyeball. They're delicious. They taste somewhere between like a hazelnut and water chestnut, and they are just one of my favorite nuts. I could eat nuts like every meal. I freaking love something about the fat and protein. My body just loves tree nuts, seed foods of all kinds. And this is just one of the best tasting plants I've ever interacted with.
So Greg, before you leave the uh, lotus, Brooke was asking, can the ripe lotus seeds be spread in water for propagation? And if so, with some type of treatment? I guess she still has some of those that you gave her.
That's funny, yeah. So lotus seeds have been widely studied. They are some of the most enduring recalcitrant seeds. So they really do like to go in the water fresh, and they germinate best. The test that I've done, if you scarify the seed, I usually use a pair of fingernail clippers because that seed coat is so hard, and you can kind of clip the coat a little bit, and so that it gets adequate water in there. In my rain garden experiments, they have had 100% germination if I do that and get them in the water um, that same fall that they're ripe. But if you let them dry, then it might take thousands of years for them to germinate. So hard to say. Hard to say if those are still good. The ones that you have, you could certainly try them. People grow them in pots in standing water because that's what they need. My rain garden is gravel bottom, and that's not really appropriate. They want a mucky soil. And so they haven't overwintered in my garden, but the seeds have certainly been good to germinate.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Earlier, when you started talking about the American lotus, you were mentioning a workshop that you had attended. And so curious as to how do those that are on the call, find out about such workshops?
Well, I mean, I can refer you to a workshop I'm doing this fall on acorn processing. So we haven't gotten to acorns yet, and I'm not sure we will given how much time we have. But acorns are one of those staple foods that is the trees give you a ton of carbohydrate, which is unusual for a tree seed. Usually tree seeds are, again, kind of fat and protein. But we're hosting a weekend workshop October 25th through 27th on processing acorns. You can go to the Great Lakes Foragers Gathering in Southern Michigan. It's in June. Great place to learn about all of this stuff. There's an excellent new book that came out by Samuel Thayer. I'll drop his name in the chat here. It's a field guide for foraging, and he's based in Wisconsin. It's like 600 pages of the most authoritative foraging stuff. Great stuff.
Great, thank you. Well, that answers another question about foraging books. So it sounds like Sam Thayer might be someone to look up.
Yeah, Sam has some great books. There's also Wild Food Plants of Indiana, which was published in the 70s, I think, by Alan McPherson and his partner, who have authored a lot of like outdoorsman kind of books for Indiana. They were primitive skills geeks in the Bloomington area. I think he might still be around.
I'm sorry, what was the name again?
Wild Food Plants of Indiana. It's out of print, but you can still find copies.
Okay, great.
Excellent book. So I'm going to just skip ahead a little bit into my presentation. There's amaranth and lamb's quarters. These are great plants to get to know. The seeds are very small, but they were gathered, especially lamb's quarters was one of the traditional food plants prior to the introduction of corn, beans, and squash. These often grow as a weed in our gardens, but we let them grow a little bit and then we gather them. We just tip the ripening seed heads into buckets and slap them around in there and let the loose, the ripe seeds knock out into the bucket. Makes it super easy to clean them later with a little bit of winnowing. I don't love them though. I don't love lamb's quarter seeds. They irritate me. Something about the chemistry. But amaranth seeds, I do. I do love those. They're little glassy black seeds that you get from the wild amaranths. And several of those are native and several are introduced. I don't discriminate. I use them both. There's a picture of the seeds. Those are amaranth seeds on the left and then lamb's quarter seeds on the right. The lamb's quarter seeds on the right, you can also use in that green stage. So before they ripen, you can strip those off and sprinkle them on salads and things. So that's maybe my preferred way to use lamb's quarters. Okay, here's oak. I can't do a seed saving for sustenance workshop without talking about acorns. So acorns are most eaten today by Koreans and native Californians. I read a story about a native California family that devotes an entire bedroom to their acorn harvest. And so kind of like in a coal room where you would have, these like board slats that you'd put up in the door, they put these slats in the doorway. So they just have like a big ball pit sort of situation for their acorns. And they go gather acorns and just basket loads of acorns go into the bedroom, just right on the floor. And they're mixed in with California bay laurel leaves that help keep the bugs out. If you're gathering acorns, you're going to get bugs. Okay. And the kids, they take turns going in and stringing up all the acorns every day as they dry in there. And that family would put up 2,000 pounds of acorns in a typical year to supply the food for their family. That's a lot. That's a lot of acorn. It's a lot of food. So acorn, that name means not corn. So corn comes from it is kind of an old word for grains. And it's like grains, but it's not grains. Most acorns, you cannot just pick them up and eat because of the condensed tannins in them. They are hepatotoxic for your liver. Some tannins, like those found in berries, can be nutritive, but not the ones in acorns. Don't be fooled. They will poison you. So we use a lot of water. It can be hot water. It makes it go a little faster. It can be cold water. There's benefits to each. Come to the acorn workshop if you want to find out more about that. And then after it's leached, so the acorns are collected, dried, cracked, sorted, re-soaked, and then ground, and then they're leached with water, and then they're re-dehydrated again, and they're ground up again to get acorn flour. So it is a lot of processing. But if you are someone who maybe has in a garden, you've grown corn like this, which I do as well, for corn, you're preparing your field, you're planting, you're fertilizing, you're weeding, you're fertilizing again, you're weeding again, and then you're protecting the crops from all the different predators that come in for it. And then you're harvesting it, you're drying it, you're taking the kernels off the cob, then you're cleaning those, then you're grinding that, or you're processing it more. So either way you go, it's a lot of processing to grow your own food and work with it. So, I mean, corn is this amazing food that produces so much for us, but it takes such intensive agriculture the way that we make most of it today. I want folks to think about maybe supplement your diet with a little bit of acorn or a little bit of wild lotus, or maybe it's, you're gathering the lamb's quarter seeds alongside the other seeds in your garden for a little bit of food. And like, for instance, I grow corn. I'm going to stop sharing now. I grow corn and beans and other seed crops in my garden for food. And, like this year, I might grow 20 pounds of black beans. It's a lot of black beans for my family. It's a year's supply of black beans for my family. But I could go to the grocery store and buy that for $40, right? Like, I can make $40 in an hour. It takes me a lot longer than that to grow 20 pounds of black beans and process them. So why do we even want to go through that trouble? It's the meaning, it's the connection, it's the reassurance, the confidence that I have that I know that I can do this from seeds that I've gathered, and I don't need the grocery store if something happens to the grocery store. I don't want to. I don't want to have to just live on what I can grow and gather. I love being able to go and buy chocolate. I love being able to go to the store and get, some cream for my coffee. But if I didn't have that, I could live with that. I could live with it. I'd be all right. I can make a living. And so, I've been growing plants in my garden from seed for some of them for over 10 years and have never bought those seeds again. It's a big expense. So I think there's just a lot of connection and meaning that comes from working with these seeds and these plants, and year after year being able to put my energy into them. They put their energy back into me, and it's an exchange that we have. It's a coevolution that we have. And I feel connected and more inspired to want to take care of my land and my people and my local cultures from having that connection. And so I want to share that. I want to share that with you. So my challenge to you is to try and eat something wild every day. You can do it. Maple syrup is wild, okay? Maple syrup is one of the most commonly foraged foods that is still in our food supply, and delicious. One of the traditional breakfasts in Miami culture is wild rice with maple sugar and wild blueberries. Like, if that's not good, I don't know what is. So are there other questions? I see Deb has put contact stuff in here for me. Thank you, Deb. And thank you, Mariah, too, for hosting.
Yep. I think we've got through all of those questions. Looks like, let's see. How is lamb's quarter leaves best consumed? Are they steamed?
I like harvesting the little tips, they look a little bit dusty, and that's all the glands on lamb's quarters. Lamb's quarters they can concentrate salts in the little glands on their leaves. So they can be a little bit salty to taste as well, which can be good because when you're eating forage foods, a lot of times it can be a little bland. So I like eating those. I'll saute those tips, with other foods lightly, gently. They don't need a lot of processing, but they can also be eaten fresh and green. So they can be eaten raw, cooked, either way. And one thing to watch out for with lamb's quarter leaves is they do get a leaf miner, and you don't want to eat bug poop. It might make you sick.
Seriously?
Seriously.
All right. So it's just like washing the lettuce from the grocery store, I suppose, right? You want to rinse off
in this case, it's a leaf miner. So they're in there in the leaf. You can't get it out of there.
Oh, yeah. So you have to
So you just avoid those.
Yeah.
Right. You wouldn't want to eat it. You'll see it.
Yeah. Well, it's like most leaf miners, right? You've got the little squirrely lines through the leaves. Let's see here. So Greg has said, or maybe it's more of a comment, I think this is a great sequel to the problem that is invasive species. Most of the time we talk about replacing with native pollinators and not native food sources, which is a really good point, Jeff, in that we don't necessarily think about what we can plant that we can actually eat.
I agree completely. And a lot of those invasive species you can eat too. So maybe you're pulling garlic mustard at your your local nature preserve, and you're replanting with something like sochan, which is also, you might know it as cut-leaved coneflower, or something like that. Yeah, or nettles, right? Nettles you can eat. You can make medicine with it. It's a fiber plant. It's an amazing plant. And there's a lot of different native species of nettles that could be planted. Most people, aren't into those kind of uncharismatic plants. So I think that's one reason native food plants have not been maybe more elevated, is because they're maybe a little more common, a little less exotic. We tend to be in our gardens a little bit more of like collector focused on plants. And if you come to my garden, you will see mostly edible, medicinal, useful type plants, and it is a little wild looking. It's not a super tended nursery style garden. And I think that's better that way.
Yeah.
Imagine that.
I'm gonna have to go out and see if I can eat some of that black snake root, because it's all over the place. So, um, when you aren't foraging on your own property, where might you wander off to that is legal?
Great question. It depends on where you're at and what's accessible to you. In most public lands, parks, state parks, forests, and places like that, foraging is generally discouraged. Certainly, nature preserves, we're not foraging in nature preserves unless you have specific permission and it's involving invasive removal. Like, I know there's a company where my mom lives in California that goes up and they harvest all the fennel pollen, the invasive fennel pollen, out of the nature preserves in Northern California, and then they sell that as a spice. I think it's a brilliant technique to control the fennel and also have an awesome business with amazing flavor. But definitely, we're not harvesting in nature preserves. I go to kind of untended places. I like greenways. I like places that aren't quite parks, aren't quite private, maybe don't know, maybe nobody else quite knows, and maybe nobody's really watching this land or tending to it. Those are the places I like. Stream sides, ditches, greenways, alleyways. But a lot of times, because I'm in an urban environment, a lot of the plants that I'm gathering are not native. Now, if you're gathering native plants, you need to be more cautious and more careful with how much you're gathering, and making sure that you're leaving enough for its ecological connections, because something else is eating it too. I see Brooks asking, is there use for the superweeding mugwort? I'm so glad you asked. Courtney, the same medicine person who told me about wanting the Newman to be sacred to all different cultures to protect the plant, because then we'd all be invested in its survival. She mentioned in the water ceremony that we had that she's of mixed descent, Ojibwe and European descent, and she mentioned mugwort. She said she brought mugwort in the offering bundle as a sort of form of tobacco, because that is how it was used widely traditionally, is as a smudging purification herb. It is strongly antimicrobial. Its relatives are used for malaria control, recommended by the World Health Organization in tropical areas. And it is an herb that's said to help protect the wandering traveler. And it does have a lot of uses. So I like to take it, and I'll harvest like the 12 inches or so of growth tip of it, maybe in flowering stage or pre-flowering stage, and I'll bundle them up into kind of like a sage wand, but mugwort. Beware though, mugwort will stimulate lucid dreaming for some folks. Some folks are very sensitive to it. Some people like me, I don't hardly dream anyway, and I don't notice it. It doesn't affect me that way, but it can be, some people can be really sensitive to it.
Interesting. One final question, and then we will wrap up. Bill Daniels actually is asking, so how is the best way to connect with Native American groups that are in our individual regions, and for him, he's down in Bloomington specifically?
Bloomington, historically, as far as I know, is not a home to recent Native Americans. So that area would have been probably traveled by Miami folks, and more recently, the Lenape or Delaware folks for hunting and foraging, but may not have been a residential kind of area. Shawnee came through that part after being driven out of the Ohio Valley region. They kind of came along the Ohio River Valley and came through some of that area until kind of Tecumseh and all that stuff in northern Indiana. I would say in Bloomington, there's probably a Native American organization that is involved in Native justice and community organizing around Native issues related to the campus or other Native communities. I would look for that. Like there's a state organization we have up here in Indianapolis that you can connect to, and a lot of them are Native transplants who connect to Native culture from different areas, and I take a very inclusive view on this. So to me, like people of Mayan descent are Native Americans as much as our local Miami people, right? Indigenous thinkers think differently than we tend to in our kind of colonizer culture. And there's some commonalities, no matter what those cultures may be. And a lot of it's due to the connection to space and land. So that's where I would maybe start, like try to just go to some events, show up in some Native American spaces. I think that's a great way. And if you show up and you are, you're asking, thoughtful questions, and you're not pretending to be Native, and you're not, you're using that cultural sensitivity, then, in my experience, people are pretty open to connecting, but just beware. It's different depending on maybe who you are. Like, the people that I interact with the Miami Nation tend to be a little bit more protective of their cultural traditions, and there may be some restrictions around things like they don't tell sacred stories at the same time of year that frogs are singing. So those stories are only told after they've stopped singing in the fall, and then before the spring peepers come out in the springtime. So there's just stuff they might not want to tell you in that season, or there might be there's going to be some things that you might want to know that they don't want to tell you, and that's okay. Those are, a lot of times these folks have such trauma in the history of their cultures that they're still working to reconnect with their own traditions. And they're, as I think I heard one person put it, picking up the strings of knowledge that are still here in the land and in the landscape, but that need to be polished and scrubbed and cleaned again. I think the Anishinaabe up in the Great Lakes region, where I'm gathering the Newman, is that folks up there are a little more open to sharing, I think, because they weren't forcibly removed from the land in the same way that happened in Miami culture. So part of it's like local history stuff. So in your area, Bloomington, I'm not 100% sure, but I would look for some kind of Native American activist organization or something like that. And it's a great place to make connections. Latino organizations are a good place to make connections too.
Right. Interesting. Thank you so much, Greg. So much
Yeah.
great information. Really appreciate it. I'm going to turn it back over to Mariah to kind of wrap up the call and I guess talk about if we have anything coming up in the future.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the time. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Greg. I could listen to a whole nother hour for sure, at least. So I really appreciate that. Very interesting. But we'll go ahead and wrap up now. And if you have additional questions about the presentation for the speaker, Greg's information was linked there. You can reach out or reach out to your local Native Plant Society chapter about becoming a member. And if you want to be added to our email listing, please send a note to seed@indiananativeplants.org. And we will get you connected. So we invite you to join us on our Facebook group. Pictures and videos are welcome on how your propagating is going. And we're especially interested to hear how your community projects are going. Our next month's Zoom presentation will be on September 23rd at 5:30 p.m. with Stephanie Frishy, Native Plant Materials Specialist at the Xerces Society. She'll discuss Xerces' efforts to improve native seed supply and use, especially as it relates to invertebrate conservation. Stephanie will also share information about the newly forming Midwestern Native Seed Network, and we hope to see many of you there. If you are interested in learning more about native plants and propagation in your area, again, please consider being a member of your local chapter. Thank you, Greg, for your informative session. Thank you, Deb, for helping out. And thanks, Bill, for guiding me through my first hosting and being an amazing leader for our Native Seed Communities group. It was great to see you all. We're going to sign off now. Have fun growing from native seeds.